The quiet evening that settled over Liam's house carried the fragile stillness of a life that had recently collapsed under the weight of too many emotional storms. For weeks, perhaps even months, Liam had been moving through his days with the exhausted numbness of someone who no longer trusted his own judgment. The complicated web of relationships that had once defined his world had slowly unraveled, leaving behind a hollow space where certainty used to exist. Love, which had always been the guiding force in his life, had begun to feel more like a battlefield than a refuge. Each new conflict with the Logan family had deepened the emotional fractures that already ran through him, and the more he tried to repair those fractures, the more they seemed to widen. In the quiet moments of the evening, when the house fell silent and there were no distractions to shield him from his thoughts, Liam often found himself staring into the empty space around him, wondering how his life had reached such a complicated and painful point. The events of recent weeks had left him particularly vulnerable. His relationships with the women he loved had become tangled in misunderstandings, betrayals, and emotional exhaustion that none of them seemed capable of escaping. The Logan family, once such a powerful presence in his life, now felt like a storm cloud that followed him wherever he went. Every conversation, every memory, every unresolved argument seemed to echo through his mind with relentless persistence. Liam had always tried to believe that love could survive any conflict if people simply held on to honesty and patience. But now, standing in the middle of so many broken promises and shattered expectations, he was no longer certain that belief had ever been realistic. It was precisely in this fragile state of mind that Ivy chose to return to his life. Her arrival was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, calculated, almost gentle in its execution. One evening, when the sky outside had begun to fade into the soft blue darkness of night, Liam heard a knock at the door that felt strangely unexpected. Visitors had become rare lately. Most people who cared about him seemed hesitant to intrude on the heavy silence surrounding his life. Yet when Liam opened the door, the figure standing outside instantly stirred memories he had not allowed himself to revisit in years. Ivy stood there with the same calm composure that had always defined her presence. Time had not erased the quiet elegance that made her difficult to ignore. Her expression carried a softness that suggested concern rather than ambition, and for a moment Liam felt an unexpected wave of nostalgia wash over him. Because Ivy represented a chapter of his life that had existed before everything became so complicated. Their past had not been defined by the same explosive drama that had characterized many of Liam's other relationships. Instead, it had unfolded in a different rhythm, one shaped by shared adventures, quiet conversations, and the sense of discovery that came from exploring the world together. The memories of Amsterdam in particular lingered in Liam's mind like fragments of a dream that once felt almost perfect. Those days had been simpler, or at least they had seemed that way at the time. Ivy knew exactly which memories would awaken those emotions. When Liam stepped aside and allowed her into the house, she moved with the calm confidence of someone who had already planned every step of the evening. The warmth of the fireplace illuminated the living room, casting soft shadows across the walls and creating a space that felt strangely intimate. Ivy paused near the fire, letting the golden light settle around her as she glanced slowly around the room. For a moment, she said nothing. That silence was deliberate, because Ivy understood something about Liam that many others often overlooked. He was not simply drawn to dramatic declarations of love or grand gestures of passion. What affected him most deeply were moments of quiet emotional connection. He responded to subtlety, to memories, to the feeling that someone understood the parts of his heart that the rest of the world could not see, and Ivy was prepared to use that knowledge with precision. She began the conversation carefully, choosing words that sounded casual but carried deeper emotional echoes. She spoke about how long it had been since they last saw each other and how strange it felt to be standing in the same room again after so many years. Her voice carried the soft warmth of someone reminiscing about a chapter of life that still held meaning. Then she mentioned Amsterdam. The name alone seemed to shift something inside Liam's expression. The city had always represented a turning point in their relationship, a place where they had allowed themselves to believe that the future might hold something lasting. Between them, Ivy described the narrow streets illuminated by lanterns, the quiet canals reflecting the evening lights, and the small cafe where they once spent hours talking about everything that felt important at the time. As she spoke, Liam found himself pulled into those memories almost against his will. He remembered the cold air drifting over the canals, the laughter that came easily back then, and the feeling that life still held endless possibilities. In those days he had not yet been caught in the endless cycle of emotional conflict that now defined his relationships. For a brief moment, the pain of his present life faded. And that was exactly what Ivy intended. Her recollection of the past was not accidental nostalgia. It was a carefully constructed emotional pathway designed to lead Liam back toward the feelings he once associated with her. She understood that people in emotional turmoil often reach for memories that remind them of simpler times, and she wanted to become that memory. The fire crackled softly between them as the conversation continued, each memory weaving another thread into the fragile emotional space forming around Liam's heart. Ivy did not push him aggressively. She did not demand explanations or apologies. Instead, she allowed the past to unfold naturally through her words, creating the illusion that the evening was simply about reconnecting with someone who once mattered deeply. But beneath the gentle tone of the conversation, Ivy's mind remained sharp and calculating. Her return to Liam's life had never been about reconciliation alone. The truth was far more complex. For years, Ivy had quietly carried the bitterness of how the Logan women had treated her. Their dismissive attitudes, their subtle insults, and their refusal to truly accept her as someone worthy of Liam's attention had left scars that never fully healed. She had watched as they repeatedly pulled Liam back into their orbit, reshaping his life in ways that always seemed to leave her standing on the outside. The humiliation of those moments had burned itself into Ivy's memory, and she had never truly forgiven them. So when she learned about Liam's recent emotional collapse, she saw an opportunity that felt almost inevitable. Revenge, Ivy believed, did not always require confrontation or anger. Sometimes the most effective revenge was quiet and strategic. Sometimes it involved simply placing the right person in the right position at the right moment. Liam, vulnerable and emotionally exhausted, was now exactly where she needed him to be. As the evening continued, Ivy allowed herself to move slightly closer to the fire, positioning herself near Liam in a way that seemed natural rather than deliberate. The warmth of the room softened the tension between them, creating an atmosphere where emotional barriers felt easier to lower. Liam spoke more openly than he expected to. The loneliness he had been carrying for weeks began to surface in quiet confessions about how lost he felt. He described the constant emotional turmoil that had followed him through every relationship. The way each attempt at happiness seemed to collapse under the weight of outside interference. Ivy listened carefully, offering sympathy at precisely the moments when he needed it most. But while Liam believed he was simply sharing his pain with someone who understood him, Ivy was studying every word, every hesitation, every emotional vulnerability, because each one revealed another way she could tighten her influence over him. The distance between them gradually disappeared as the conversation deepened. At one point Liam leaned back in his chair, exhausted by the emotional honesty of the evening. Ivy moved closer without hesitation, resting beside him near the fire as if the closeness had happened naturally. The glow of the flames illuminated their faces, casting a warm light that made the moment appear almost romantic. To anyone watching from the outside, it might have looked like the quiet beginning of reconciliation between two people who once shared something meaningful, but the truth of the moment was far more complicated, and far more dangerous, because neither of them realized that someone else was already watching. Across the street, partially hidden by the shadows of a parked vehicle, an unfamiliar figure held a camera equipped with a powerful lens. The stranger had arrived quietly earlier in the evening, moving with the practiced caution of someone accustomed to observing without being noticed. Through the lens of the camera, the scene inside Liam's living room appeared perfectly framed. The firelight, the closeness between Liam and Ivy, the subtle intimacy of their body language. The stranger adjusted the focus carefully, waiting for the precise moment when the distance between them disappeared completely. Then the shutter clicked. The photograph captured exactly what the observer had hoped to see. Liam and Ivy sitting together near the fireplace, their faces illuminated by warm light, their closeness suggesting something far more intimate than a simple conversation. It was the kind of image that could ignite suspicion instantly. The kind of image that could travel through the complicated networks of the Forrester and Logan families like a spark dropped into dry grass. The camera clicked again, and again, each photograph preserving another angle of the moment, another version of the story that could later be told through carefully selected evidence. Inside the house, Liam and Ivy remained completely unaware of what was happening beyond the walls. The emotional atmosphere of the room had drawn their attention entirely inward, focusing on the quiet connection forming between them. But somewhere in the darkness outside, a plan was already beginning to take shape. Because the stranger holding the camera was not simply a curious passerby. The photographs were not random souvenirs. They were ammunition, and once those images reached the right people, the consequences would spread far beyond Liam's living room. Within hours, the fragile balance of relationships that held the Logan and Forrester families together could collapse into chaos once again. Liam, still struggling to rebuild his life after so many emotional battles, had no idea that this quiet evening would soon become the center of a storm powerful enough to shake every corner of the family he once believed would always protect him. The photograph had already been taken, and soon, the entire world around him would feel its impact. The morning sunlight filtered gently through the tall windows of the Logan office, casting long golden reflections across the polished surface of Katie's desk. The building itself carried the quiet hum of routine, phones ringing in distant rooms, assistants exchanging brief conversations in the hallway, the muted rhythm of a company functioning exactly as it was supposed to. Yet inside Katie Logan's office, there was a sense of fragile calm that had taken months to rebuild. For a long time, Katie had fought to reclaim a sense of stability in her life after years of emotional upheaval that seemed almost impossible to escape. Love, betrayal, forgiveness, heartbreak. Those words had once defined nearly every chapter of her personal history. But lately she had begun to believe that perhaps, finally, the storms had passed. Bill Spencer had promised her that things were different now. For years, the relationship between Katie and Bill had moved like a violent tide, pulling them together with overwhelming passion only to tear them apart with equal intensity. Bill had always been a man driven by power, ambition, and impulses that often ignored the emotional consequences of his decisions. Loving him had never been easy. Yet Katie had never been able to erase the belief that somewhere beneath Bill's ruthless exterior was a man capable of genuine devotion. In recent months, Bill himself had claimed that he had changed. He had spoken with unusual sincerity about wanting to become a better man. Not just for himself but for the people he loved. His public statements had reflected that transformation. Interviews, appearances, and even quiet conversations with family members had all carried the same message. Bill Spencer was leaving behind the reckless patterns of his past. He wanted to support Katie, protect their family, and rebuild the trust that had been damaged by so many past mistakes. Katie had listened to those promises carefully. Part of her had wanted to believe them completely. Another part, the part that had been wounded too many times before, remained cautious. Still, Bill's determination seemed genuine. His behavior had softened in ways that surprised even those who knew him best. The relentless businessman who once thrived on conflict now seemed almost reflective. When he spoke about Katie, there was a sincerity in his voice that suggested he understood how much he had once risked losing. For a moment, it felt like they were finally moving towards something stable. But the Logan family had always understood a painful truth about Bill Spencer. Stability rarely lasted long in his world. Katie had been reviewing a series of documents related to Logan business matters when the moment happened. It was an ordinary task, one that required attention but carried none of the emotional intensity that once dominated her life. A fresh stack of magazines had been delivered to the office earlier that morning. Part of the routine collection of fashion publications, business journals, and entertainment media that often passed through the Logan building. One magazine in particular sat near the corner of her desk. At first Katie barely noticed it. Soap Opera Digest was not the type of publication she usually read during a workday. But the bold colors of the cover caught her attention just enough for her eyes to drift toward it. The magazine had been placed face up, the glossy surface reflecting the morning light in a way that made the headline impossible to ignore. Katie reached for it absent-mindedly, expecting nothing more than the usual entertainment gossip that rarely held personal significance for her. But the moment she lifted the magazine, the world around her seemed to collapse into a single frozen image. The cover photograph showed Bill Spencer. And he was not alone. Standing beside him in a breathtaking white wedding gown was Brooke Logan. The photograph looked like something out of a carefully staged fantasy. Bill wore a formal black tuxedo, his expression confident and intense, while Brooke stood beside him with a radiant smile that seemed to glow beneath the soft lighting of the studio photograph. Their hands were intertwined in a way that suggested intimacy rather than simple friendship. Above them, the headline stretched across the cover in bold letters that seemed almost cruel in their directness. Brooke Logan, the final woman in Bill Spencer's life. Katie's fingers loosened instinctively. The magazine slipped from her hands and fell onto the desk with a sharp sound that echoed through the quiet office. For a moment she did not move. The shock of what she had just seen felt almost unreal, as if her mind refused to accept the possibility that the image was genuine. Her heart began pounding with a sudden intensity that made it difficult to breathe. Every promise Bill had made to her in recent months rushed back into her memory with painful clarity. He had said he had changed. He had said she was the future he wanted. Yet here he was, standing on the cover of a national magazine in wedding attire with her own sister. Katie's face slowly drained of color as the emotional reality of the moment settled over her. The feeling was not just anger. It was something deeper and far more painful. It was betrayal. Across the office, Liam and Hope had been discussing a separate project when the sound of the magazine hitting the desk caught their attention. Both of them turned toward Katie at the same time, immediately noticing the change in her expression. Hope was the first to step forward. Katie's hands were trembling slightly as she stared down at the magazine cover lying on the desk. The glossy page reflected the image again, forcing her to confront the sight she wished she could erase. Hope reached the desk and looked down. The moment her eyes landed on the photograph, a wave of unease passed through her. Liam moved beside her seconds later, and his reaction was even more immediate. The tension in his posture revealed how quickly he understood the implications of what they were seeing, because the image on that magazine cover represented something far more complicated than a simple publicity photograph. It represented the resurrection of a history that had once torn their family apart. Bill Spencer and Brooke Logan had always shared a connection that defied simple explanation. Their relationship had existed in a strange emotional territory that often blurred the boundaries between loyalty and betrayal. Over the years they had found themselves drawn to each other at moments when doing so caused enormous pain for everyone around them. Katie knew that history better than anyone. She had lived through the consequences of it. Years earlier, Bill's relationship with Brooke had shattered her sense of trust and left wounds that took years to heal. The betrayal had not only damaged her marriage but had also created deep fractures within the Logan family itself. Even after time had passed and forgiveness had slowly replaced anger, the memory of that betrayal had never truly disappeared. And now, staring at the cover of that magazine, Katie felt those old wounds tearing open again. Hope looked at Liam with visible concern. Both of them understood the dangerous emotional territory this situation could create. The Logan family had spent years rebuilding fragile connections after the chaos caused by Bill and Brooke's past involvement. If the rumors suggested by this photograph were true, those fragile connections could collapse once again. Liam felt a heavy sense of dread forming in his chest as he studied the image more closely. Bill and Brooke standing together in wedding attire was not something that could easily be dismissed as a harmless publicity stunt, even if the photograph had been taken for a promotional shoot or a media interview. The symbolism alone was enough to ignite speculation across every corner of their complicated family dynamic, and speculation, in their world, had a way of turning into emotional catastrophe. Katie finally spoke, though her voice carried a fragile edge that revealed how deeply the image had shaken her. She asked the question that was now echoing in all their minds. Why would Bill allow this photograph to exist? The silence that followed felt unbearably heavy. Hope tried to imagine possible explanations. Perhaps it was part of a media campaign, a publicity misunderstanding, or even an old photograph resurfacing without context. But the headline itself suggested something far more deliberate. Brooke Logan, the final woman in Bill Spencer's life. Those words were not accidental. Someone had chosen them carefully. And once those words reached the public, they would begin spreading through the media world with unstoppable momentum. Katie slowly lowered herself into the chair behind her desk, her mind struggling to reconcile the man Bill claimed to be with the image now staring back at her from the magazine cover. For a moment she allowed herself to remember the conversations they had shared recently. Bill had spoken with such determination about rebuilding trust. He had promised that the mistakes of the past would never repeat themselves. But the photograph suggested something else entirely. It suggested that the past might not be finished with them after all. Liam rested his hands on the edge of the desk, his thoughts racing through the consequences that might soon follow. The Logan family was no stranger to emotional conflict, but the possibility of Bill and Brooke becoming involved again carried particularly explosive implications. Because it would not only affect Katie, it would affect everyone. Hope could already imagine the chain reaction spreading through the family. Ridge, whose own history with Brooke remained one of the most complicated relationships in the Forrester and Logan worlds, would certainly react strongly to the image. The Forresters themselves might see the photograph as another chapter in the endless cycle of romantic chaos that seemed to define the Logan family's public reputation. But for Katie, the impact was far more personal. This was not just gossip or speculation. This was a wound reopening in front of her eyes. Katie reached slowly toward the magazine again, her fingers brushing the glossy surface as if touching it might somehow make the image less real. But the photograph remained unchanged, its bold colors and dramatic headline continuing to deliver the same painful message. Bill Spencer, Brooke Logan, together, in wedding attire. Katie felt a wave of emotional exhaustion sweep over her as she leaned back in the chair. The promises Bill had made now echoed in her mind with a haunting clarity. She wanted to believe there was some explanation, some misunderstanding that would restore the fragile trust she had begun to rebuild. But the image on that magazine cover had already planted a seed of doubt that would not easily disappear. Across the room, Liam and Hope exchanged another worried glance. They both understood that this single photograph had the power to ignite a chain reaction capable of reshaping every relationship in their family. The history between Bill and Brooke was too complicated, too emotionally charged, to remain quietly contained once the media began circulating the image. And if Katie's trust in Bill collapsed again, the emotional fallout could spread far beyond their office walls. Outside the Logan building, the city continued moving through its ordinary routines, unaware that a storm was beginning to form within one of its most influential families. But inside that quiet office, 3 people were already beginning to understand the truth. The photograph was only the beginning. Soon the entire Logan family would feel the shockwaves of what it represented. And once those shockwaves began to spread, no one could predict where the emotional destruction might find.